The price of gold is going through the roof because of global geopolitical developments, and largely because of a loss of trust in the US dollar. This has been going on for the last 15 years or so. Countries have been aggressively stockpiling gold, and that has accelerated significantly in the past 5 to 7 years. In 2018 to 2019, gold buying reached record highs for central banks across the world. In 2022, when the US froze $300 billion worth of assets in Russia, the gold buying increased even more, and it's been averaging over 1,000 tons per year from 2022 to 2024 and 2025. China's been stockpiling gold for the last 18 months or more, quietly and aggressively. This is partially driven by inflation. It's driven by things like Trump saying that he wants a weak US dollar. And let's cut to a clip of that right now.
It doesn't sound good, but you make a hell of a lot more money with a weaker dollar. Not a weak dollar, but a weaker dollar than you do with a strong dollar.
It's also driven by Trump pressuring the Fed for rate cuts aggressively. If you've watched any of my previous videos, I believe the reason Trump's pursuing rate cuts and trying to pursue a weak US dollar is for personal reasons. I think that stockpiling Bitcoin and his portfolio would benefit largely from inflation. In 2020, when rates were cut to zero, everyone that had lots of assets, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's stocks, whether it's any type of riskier asset, those people are doing well. So let's zoom out to the big picture. Let's look at this from the perspective of foreign countries. Imagine you see all of these developments. You see Trump saying that he wants a weaker dollar. You see that he's pursuing these inflationary policies. So now you're even more concerned about losing purchasing power by holding on to US dollars as a reserve asset. That's always been a concern. All fiat currencies devalue over time, but there's more concern about that now. There's more concern about increased rates of inflation. Everyone knows that. That's one of the main narratives that people talk about when they're talking about gold prices going up. But like I talked about earlier with Russia, there's an additional risk associated with holding on to US dollars, and that is your relationship with the United States. I think that countries are worried about getting assets frozen if they don't agree with the United States, and so they're hedging their bets. They're buying gold to preserve purchasing power in the face of unclear US relations. And the United States has become increasingly isolated in its foreign policy. I mean, if we look at the UN Security Council, and if you're not familiar with the UN Security Council, it has 5 permanent members. It has the United States, China, Russia, France, and the UK. Those are permanent members. And there's 10 rotating members. And the 5 permanent members have veto power. So the United States has veto power. And all other members of the Security Council are threatening to support Palestine as a nation, to give Palestine the rights that are associated with it being identified as a nation, except the United States. Recently, France moved to recognize Palestine, and the UK also just recently, kind of surprisingly, addressed that as well, saying they're going to recognize Palestine, recognize them as a state, if Israel doesn't make significant moves for peace. So everybody, Russia, China, UK, France, all those people are backing Palestine. They're not fond of the US foreign policy. But the United States continues to back Israel. This might seem kind of irrelevant, but it highlights the fact that the United States is becoming isolated, like I said. And if you're worried about US relations impacting your purchasing power, you're worried about assets getting frozen, you're worried about these things in addition to inflation risks, that's going to drive you to purchase even more gold. That's not to mention the impact of tariffs. If you just look at Trump's current policies, they're pretty manic. I mean, he's talking about annexing parts of Canada, talking about annexing Greenland, talking about, getting back the Panama Canal. He's renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Basically, I think he has too much going on. He essentially represents additional instability. It's completely unpredictable what he's going to do from an economic perspective. And instability, risk, these things contribute to countries wanting to preserve their purchasing power in gold. So how does any of this relate to you? A lot of people watch political commentary. They watch commentary about economics and global developments, and then they don't get any insight into how that impacts their personal life. Arguably, all they're doing is stressing themselves out, making themselves anxious, when really they have relatively little power over the situation. But here I like to address how you can take action personally. And if you've watched my other videos, I'm a little bit cautious about Bitcoin right now. I kind of think that Bitcoin is likely to dip significantly before continuing to increase in price. The reason for that is because there are so many companies buying Bitcoin and not actually pursuing profitable ventures. If you look at Safedan Ammous, who is the author of the Bitcoin standard, and he is also the author of the fiat standard. He talks about how fiat currencies often cause people to pursue unprofitable projects. And that's because those projects appear profitable in nominal terms because they're earning money. There's interest, those sorts of things. But what's not clear is that the interest they're making is actually negative when you account for inflation. So all of these projects are pursued and they're subsidized and they're actually inefficient. I think Bitcoin is becoming an extension of that to some extent. When you have MicroStrategy that's just taking out large amounts of debt to buy Bitcoin and not pursuing any real world developments, they're not hiring staff, they're not expanding in any real way. All they're doing is buying Bitcoin. I think that creates a lot of risk and instability. That said, I think they are providing some value by giving Bitcoin more credibility. When you have someone like Michael Saylor, who is a graduate of MIT, who's an entrepreneur, who's a really smart guy and who's knowledgeable about history, that gives Bitcoin credibility. When BlackRock starts to endorse Bitcoin, that gives it credibility. So it's not like a completely terrible project funded by subsidies and fiat currency. It is something where there is some value there. That value is just the credibility that those people give Bitcoin. But I don't think it should be approached without caution. I do think it's a little bit more practical than gold, though, because as you're buying larger and larger amounts of gold, it becomes more and more expensive, not only to verify the authenticity of the gold, but also to transport it. I mean, that's one of the main appeals of fiat currency in the first place, is that it's saleable across space. And what that means is that it doesn't cost very much to transport it. Dollar bills are very lightweight. You can carry them in your wallet. If you try to carry around a gold bar, it's not going to be the same. You're going to have to you're going to have to spend a lot of money to transport that. And arguably that's one of the main appeals of fiat currency. But Bitcoin has all of the advantages. It's easy to verify, it's saleable across space, and it's saleable across time, meaning it's easy to transport purchasing power into the future. And the same thing cannot be said about the US dollar or any other fiat currency. So in conclusion, the US dollar and other fiat currencies are losing trust, and people aren't wanting to hold on to them as a reserve asset. The euro was surpassed by gold as a reserve asset, and I believe the dollar is going to come next. It may take a decade, it may take 20 years, it may take 30 years, but I believe that the dollar is not going to be held as a reserve currency as it becomes increasingly risky to hold on to it. Now, what's it going to be replaced by? Central banks are clearly very adverse to risk. They're not going to stockpile Bitcoin. It's still in the early days of Bitcoin, arguably. I mean, it's only been about 12 years. Compare that to gold. Gold's been around since like the beginning of time, okay? People have been using gold as a reserve for years, for forever, pretty much. So that transition is going to take a lot of time. And Bitcoin may collapse and rebound, but I think that, 40 years down the line, 100 years down the line, central banks are going to see that Bitcoin is a better alternative to gold in terms of the cost of transporting it. And for that reason, I think that buying Bitcoin, if you're able to tolerate a large downside in the short term, it's going to be a good thing to hold on to in the long run. All right, that's all I have. If you like hearing about political developments, if you like hearing about economic developments, you know what to do.